Yeah, because I mean, whether you want to make a completely dialogue-driven game or you just want to have some nice flavor text on NPCs, what I'm going to show you could just be like step up to somebody and they say, "Hi, how you doing?" Or it could be like you create a game with, that's entirely dialogue based. It's, has complex branching dialogue with like, it remembers decisions that you've made and can like, do things based on those. Or you could create an NPC who's like a shopkeeper that you go up and you navigate dialogue, and the choice you make gives you an item and subtracts currency. And so it can be really big or really small. And so because this is going to take a little bit of time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through and show you some of the tools that I researched in order to give you some of these options. And the ones, we're going to use a very simple one that's built into Unity. And I'm also going to show you a more complex one that lives outside of Unity that you export to Unity. But basically, the reason why we're doing this at this point is because of the survey where, we talked about like, well, here's a bunch of different things we could study, we could go over. I wanted to give y'all some agency about, what you're most interested in. So out of the 4 responses, the creating branching game narrative and dialogue and player choices was one of the highest rated. Others that will probably come up next, NPC movement using AI nav mesh, which is not nearly as daunting as it sounds, and creating a game master, like some script that sits there and pays attention to the win state, the lose state, respawning the player and stuff like that. And so the first, the main thing that we're going to look at, the example that's actually building on your machines, is using this tool called the node-based dialogue system asset, which you can find a link to here. But what I did was, the reason why I gave you a already built project was because there's a couple of things from this asset that I needed to fix up a little, and I wanted to give you a working example to start with, and then you can start to customize your own. You can go to the asset store and find this asset and load it into your project. But you might have to fix a couple things, like by default it doesn't use TextMesh Pro in its UI. It uses the old version of legacy text. And so there's some, and it's also a little bit not exactly like, set up correctly and clean and nice. So, I'll actually show you how you can take the cleaned up version that we have in this project and actually export it as a custom package so you could bring it in, or you can go to the asset store and just download this version. But what's nice about this is it's free. It is a little buggy. Particularly there's this there's this tool, this window here where you can have a node graph set up where you put the different things, the different flow of your dialogue. And sometimes it gets scrambled, or sometimes the connections get broken and stuff like that. So you get what you pay for to some degree. But something, so what we're going to look at is an example. This is the thing and the link to the thing that I provided to you, which is just like I quickly put together an example of a couple of different ways you could use this dialogue in a 3D scene, although it'll totally work in 2D or totally work with a purely UI game. But there's other tools, and the main ones I looked into, we're actually going to look at this first one called Arcweave because I think it's really promising. But there's one called Dialog System that was actually used for Disco Elysium. It has a free trial that you can try out, but it's actually quite expensive. I think it's like 100 euros. And so if you're willing to invest in something that is that powerful of a tool, like, yeah, it's got the credentials of having, it's a Unity tool, and it's got the credentials of having shipped like Disco Elysium and some other things, but it's expensive. Does it work with other? I think it has a version that works with Unreal and possibly with Godot. Actually, that's one of the things that's also a benefit of Arcweave, which we're going to actually use. Arcweave has a free trial that has a certain limitations, like you only have so many nodes, and that you might eventually want to get more. But the cool thing about Arcweave is it is a web app that exports to Unity, to Unreal, or to Godot. And so you can use it in any of those engines. So you learn it once and you can use it in a bunch of different contexts. There's also these tools like Spinner and Ink and Prata and Artisy, which you can look into. And in particular, like Artisy and Ink have been around for a long time. And they're really more for like kind of creating purely narrative games, but you can export their stuff and they have importers into Unity and other things. And so they've got some degree of that support, but they're a little more scripty. If you like seeing the node graph of your dialogue and where it branches and stuff like that, then you're going to want something like the tool node-based dialogue system or Arcweave or dialogue system here, which I said is super expensive, because things like Ink and Artisy tend to be more like you're writing and just marking things up like HTML. So Arcweave, which I'm going to give you a demo of, and if there's time at the end of class, we'll dabble with a little bit. But essentially, you get a free Arcweave account, and then you can download. You can get the Unity package that allows you to use it in Unity for free. It also has one for Unreal and for Godot. There's instructions for a quick start and for importing into Unity. But it's the web. You use the web app to lay out, your dialogue and even insert images, and it can get fairly complex. You got defined characters and locations and stuff. And then what you do is you export it, and it creates like, all the code and all the properties in like a JSON file. And so I'll actually show you, let's see, that I've got it actually here. So for example, you can see, when you come to Arcweave, if I just started from like the home page, you can sign up for a free account, or you can, check out like the pricing. So like, let's see, basic is for free, but you only get 200 items per project in 3 projects. But if you go up to $15 a month, of course it's a monthly fee, and that hurts in the long run. You're like, okay, you get unlimited items and unlimited projects, etc. So from here, since I'm already logged in and I have a free account, I can go to the app. And so here's kind of the front page with the different projects. So as an example, like I created a very simple thing just right here while I was waiting for y'all. And you can essentially just kind of right click to create an element, and then, give it like a title of the person talking, for example, and then the content. But what I did was, so I said, okay, let's get started. Welcome to the class on Dialog. It's me speaking. Is everybody ready to go? And then, to create a choice like this, all you do is, create these nodes. Like for example, if I wanted a choice here, I create another element just like this one, but then I drag here, and then I do the same, drag here, and it automatically interprets that as a choice. So you can see that, like, for example, and so I've got like a little conversation here, and I can actually play it to test it here. And so here we go. Let's get started. Welcome to the class on Dialog. Is everybody ready to go? What's your answer? Yes. Yes. That's great. Let's do it. But if I wanted to restart and say, well, what if you were a bunch of sourpusses and you said no, and then I would be like, oh, shucks, now I'm sad panda. And so, but I can just close that. And so you can create, like, as you've seen, you can create characters, you can create locations, etc. And you can have multiple of these things and string them together. So an example of a more complicated one is this example that comes with it called the castle. And so you can see that you can add like notes and color them, and you can include images that will show up along the way. And so this one actually has a main board, and it has like some, a couple of other sub boards that you go to. So for example, if I were to start this thing and play it, so it says, you've just arrived at the castle. To the north, you see the castle entrance. Enter the castle. So now you can decide to follow the path north, enter the house. And so you follow the path north and go further down. There's even some moody music in some places. You can talk to this guy. And then he says, he asks if you know who he is, and kicks your ass, and that's the end. But you can go and find the key that lets you know who that guy is, and then yada yada yada. But the thing is, if you have something like this, and then you're ready, you can just say export for Unity and include the asset. So you can actually include any pictures that you might have included here. And when you export it, what happens is you get a file. You can see that it's now downloaded this file. And if I look in the file, essentially I have a JSON file, which is just a text file that has all this stuff in it. And then it has the assets, the images and the audio that's used there. And you essentially just drag all this stuff into Unity, and then you connect it up to the stuff that's provided by their plugin. So, it's actually, it's not that much more complicated than what we're actually going to be working with. But the thing is, you're not in the editor. You have to switch between the editor and this web tool, and the web tool, of course, requires an internet connection. So how are you doing with, do you have the project built at this point? Do you see something like this?
I don't have the demo scene. I think I have the assets, but the scene is...
Yeah, that was a test, actually. No. Actually, what I realized is that I put the scene in a very dumb place. I have really poor folder organization, but it gives me the opportunity to show you a trick. Which is if I go to assets here, I can click this search by type, and if I click scene, it will show me all the scenes under assets. And so then you have a list of the scenes there. So you need to, good, yeah, so double click demo dialog scene. So that's the one you're looking for. Were you able to find it? Yeah, it's going to take just a second for the shaders to build, and then so you'll see that like really weird cyan colored world for a second, and that just means that like, okay, it's working on building the shaders. So the first thing we want to do is kind of get a sense for like, we'll go ahead and run this, because what I've set up here is I've got 3 different scenes, 3 different pirate groups here that have a dialogue set up in some different way. So if you approach one of them, any of them, when you get close, you'll see that there's a trigger that shows you to press E to start the dialogue. And then when you do, Pirate Girl will say, want some money? And if you say, hell yeah, she'll say, here you go. And you'll see that it prints in the console, I gave you money, which is just to show you that from this choice, I was able to trigger a function, and that function could have done anything. It could give you money, it could take you to the next scene, it could start combat, it could do all kinds of things. So you can have a choice that's made in the dialogue trigger logic. Or you got this guy here in the middle who asks you what your name is, and if you choose a name, like Yargablarg, he will say, hail to you, Yargablarg. So he's obviously aware of the choice that you made. And then the third example is these the skeleton and the pirate here. And Blackbeard is telling Skelly, you can see there's a little bit of an issue with the text disappearing under here, which is easy enough to fix. And so they're having an argument, and they want you to either agree with them or disagree. And if you agree, then Skeleton's like, see, I told you. So the response is different based on the choice you make. So it's demonstrating that, like, okay, that you do have branching dialogue. So yeah, it doesn't root you in place. It could do that. There's ways that this could be improved, but it's essentially kind of just a quick and dirty example of how to create these kind of dialogues. And it would work much the same if you were in a 2D game, or you could have this also work in just in a UI-based game. Any questions of what you've seen before we move on a little? Okay. How about you, Danielle? Any questions? All right, well, let's take a look at how this is actually set up. So, what we have here in the scene, we have a couple of things that, are just part of the scene, like the directional lights and the terrain. Like I had some extra characters that I'm not actually using. But then essentially you have this dialogue prefab and you have the three different sets of characters. And of course, like the player is just the standard asset or starter assets first person controller, which we've used a lot by downloading it. So the dialogue prefab does a lot of the work. It's kind of like the main thing that you need to that you would adjust or that you would use to run the. Essentially, the dialogue prefab has to be there in order to work, but you don't actually need to do anything with it. You could actually, so when you install this dialogue node-based package, in the prefabs folder, you have this dialogue prefab. And so if you created a new scene, like if I were to just kind of show you by creating a basic URP scene, if I just throw that dialogue prefab in there, like that gives me the support, and I don't need to mess with the dialogue prefab, but I won't actually be able to trigger the dialogue until I've set up the. I'll go ahead and save that just in case I need to come back to it. So what causes, what's triggering the dialogues to occur is this this dialogue trigger with a dialogue starter script on it. So essentially what I have here is, I've got an empty game object that has my character, my 3D character, and then what I've done is I've created an empty game object that has a box collider on it that, let's see if I make sure that I have the. I hate this new Unity toolbar thing. It's so confusing. Let's see, get rid of that. That's what I'm looking for. Okay, so now we can see that like this empty game object here has got a box collider on it that's set to is trigger. So it just means that like, okay, when I walk in here, this box collider is going to know, and it's going to fire this dialogue trigger, it's going to fire this dialogue starter. And this script, this dialogue starter script, is something that they give you as an example, but you can add to and build off of. But what's important is that it has a reference to this dialogue prefab. That's where it gets this dialogue behavior script from. It also has a reference to the dialogue graph that you make. So for example, like, there's a female pirate. Yeah, this is the female pirate dialogue graph. And this dialogue key panel also comes from dialogue prefab, like that. So what we can do is actually, this dialogue graph is something that you can create in Unity itself. Unlike, when we looked at Arcweave, you were building it there on their website. So if I were to actually, let's see, I double click one of these dialogue things and it opens this dialogue graph editor. And this is where I have like my node graph. Although, let's see, there it is. You can't zoom in and out, which is another one of those things you're just like, all right, like I can imagine making something really small, sure. Something big, like this would become a mess really fast. But for something simple like this, it's no big deal. So, you can see that like, I've got a node that has the person's name who's speaking, the actual text, and the sprite picture that you put in the UI itself. And that you can also connect to external functions. So the pirate girl actually, if asks you if you want some money, if you say yes, she actually calls the external function get money, which is on the same script. So for example, if I were to say, all right, if you want to create like a new dialogue from scratch, like you can already see this is kind of like funking up. All right. Yeah, the nodes don't stay in place, and sometimes they get all wonky and draw funny. So that's why I'm like not sure how far I would trust this. But if you have this Unity package installed, the node-based dialog system, if you are in the project folder and you right-click and click Create Scriptable Objects Nodes Node Graph, and so I can call this DNA class. And when I have created it, I can click Open Editor Window for it to open here. And of course, it's empty, so you don't see much. But if I create a sentence node and say like, Brian says, hello class. So that's how I would create. And you see it actually creates, what it's doing is it's creating a bunch of these are scriptable objects, which means they're just containers for data, which is a nice way of doing this. And so as I add more of these, if I create another one, and said, it's me again. And I'm like, let's do this. Now, the first challenge you're going to face is like, well, wait, how do I link these two? Because there's nothing that, immediately, unless you knew or read the documentation, there's nothing super obvious about like, well, wait, like, how do it doesn't say, I can't right click on this. There's nothing about like make connection. But what happens is if you right click on it and drag out from it, then you'll make a connection when you drop it onto the other thing. So let's have you give that a try. Just like create, and you could do this maybe in the Dialog node-based system folder. First you create scriptable object nodes node graph. And once you do, you'll have one of these things and you give it a name. And when you have it selected, you can click this Open Editor Window button in the inspector. And that will open that dialog graph editor, which will, of course, be empty until you create your first sentence node. Oh, you mean like here?
Yeah, because now they're all call centers.
Oh, these things here?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you could actually rename that, that node per se. I mean, it does, when you click on it, you will see in the inspector what the content is.
Yeah.
It would be, and when you select it here in the editor, it does highlight it there. And I think that, some of the other things that are notably missing here is like the ability to add just like a sticky note, which you saw was in Arcweave, or if you have ever used like Miro or something like that. Like it can be really useful to like be able to label things, group them, like put like a background to a bunch of nodes that says these nodes are all related in this way.
I cannot delete one of them. Once it's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, let's see, if it's highlighted blue, yeah, I think that was actually a problem that I had as well, which was like, I think that if you, let's see, if I go to here and delete it, let's see. Yeah, I think that like, let's see, I do remember this being a tricky thing to, oh, I know. You select it so that it's blue, then click outside of it and do remove selected node, which is unintuitive and prone to error and a really bad design decision. But it may be just, I mean, for somebody who's building a freely available tool, it might have just been something that, I mean, you also can't undo that delete, which is not uncommon. You can also, create these answer nodes, which is essentially like if I was asking a question here. Oh, answer node, add answer. Oh, right, yeah. So you can go like, okay, you make the choice, and then you do create a sentence mode, and that's the result of this choice. That's what it is. So for example, like this one goes to here, and then this one goes to here. So it's like, who's with me? And so then it would be like, me, not me, and then what was the question? And so then you could be like, the text here could be like, you my man, you my man. This one could be like, oh, come on. And this could be like, because each one of these is the response to the thing in the answer node.
How do you tie to a result? Like the different answers.
Oh, it's a right click and drag. So for example, if I, let's see, remove the selected node. So yeah, if I've got a sentence node here that's the response, then what I do is I kind of mouse over the icon here and then click and drag with my right mouse button and then drop it onto it, which is also less than obvious. But what you can do now is if you have created, your dialogue and it's here and you're like, well, now I want to see it. So for example, what I could do is I could say, okay, pick somebody like, the captain or the female pirate and go to their dialogue trigger game object. And then what you can do is here in dialogue starter, instead of it using the female pirate dialogue graph, you can say use the dialogue graph that you just created. So now when I run my scene and talk to the female pirate, I should see the stuff that I just created instead. So I talk to her, and so instead of asking for money, wait a minute, did I just break something? Now I'm getting, not even getting there's the E to start dialogue. What happened to you? Oh. So for some reason, like the canvas didn't show up, but the dialogue is playing when I press E. So it'd be interesting to know like how I managed to break. Oh, let me see. So in my the dialogue thing is, or this thing isn't firing, or the press E to. Oh, it is.
And the dialogue is coming up, but not the portrait.
Yes. Let's see. The portrait is based on the portrait is based on something that you put in the dialogue graph editor. So, for example, that's under sprite. So you would have to pick the sprite from there. Mm-hmm. Oh, I think that this is probably a dialogue key panel I replaced with dialogue prefab. So that was wrong. Like, so in the dialogue starter, you have the dialogue behavior, which is the dialogue prefab. You have the graph that you made. And then dialogue key panel is actually this canvas that shows you as you approach, press E to, which is something that, I pretty much just added to their example dialogue starter script. Well, let's take a look at what's in that dialogue starter script, because it's actually quite simple. So if we look at like our dialogue trigger, if we double click the script here, dialogue starter, because this is the main thing that you would customize in terms of like triggering your dialogue. And so what it has is, it has, the reference to the dialogue behavior, the prefab that, comes with it, the reference to the dialogue graph. And then this is something I added, which was in order to show the prompt when you walk up, I wanted to have it off by default, and then I can set active on it to show it. But essentially, like this is something I added. And then I also have some stuff like, okay, I want to be able to listen to player input, and I want to know if you're inside the dialogue trigger. So essentially, like when you'll see that it has a, I have that trigger box in front of the character, and I use an on trigger enter. And if the player is what enters the trigger, then I say the player is in the dialogue trigger, show the key. And if they leave that, then I remove that. And so when it calls show dialogue key, it's just showing that thing. which means that, you know, as long as the player's in the dialogue trigger and they press the E key on the keyboard, like it's using update to always be listening. Okay, did the player press the E key? All right, are they also inside the trigger? Okay, if so, then I can start dialogue. So that's how I'm starting the dialogue in this example, but in your example, you could have, like the question is what's calling start dialogue? Because start dialogue is what makes everything happen with your dialogue. Uh, and so you could essentially, you could say like, well, I'm not going to have it happen when the player, clicks the E key when they enter a trigger. Instead, I'm going to set it up so that it automatically happens when they step on a trigger, or that it happens when they press a button in the UI. And so then you would just say, okay, well, whatever, regardless of how you're doing it, you're going to call a function that says enter menu mode and dialog behavior.start dialog with the dialog graph. So that's the whole thing. And then on dialog finished, it exits the menu. So essentially, if you were to download this, it wouldn't have this on trigger enter and trigger exit, but the rest of this stuff would have come with that dialog starter script. So you can imagine the different ways that you might set this up. Like, Johannes, if you were going to implement dialogue in a game that you're thinking about, like, what would be the trigger for starting the dialogue for you?
Maybe achieving a certain game state.
Mm-hmm.
Like succeeding a check or
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So essentially, like, if you had a game master that was doing that, the game master could say, it could call this start dialogue, and then all that would happen. And so it's pretty easy to set it up so it's completely agnostic. It doesn't care if you're in a 2D game or a 3D game or a UI game. It doesn't care if you're on mobile or VR or PC or Xbox or PlayStation. Like, this would all just work the same. Mm-hmm. Oh, how did I get to this script? So one of the things you can do, so the script itself is attached to this game object, and you can see it here. It's kind of grayed out because you can't edit it. But if you double click that, then it will open up in Visual Studio, if you've got Visual Studio installed.
So how do you edit it if it's not have permission to do so?
No, you do. It's grayed out here in Unity just because you couldn't like take a different script and drop it in there, and that's what this graying out is just saying, like, this script is the component. This is not a property of this component. This is literally the component, so you can't mess with this field. They're just showing that to you. But yeah, these other things are properties of that component, that script. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you the opportunity to take a break because we're about an hour in. And then what we'll do is we'll start fresh from another, essentially, I think that, would you rather, I think it would probably be more valuable for us to start a new project, bring this dialogue package in, and try to set it up, and I'll let you choose. So for example, you can, let me see, if I go to the Unity hub, if when you create a new project, you could choose, for example, the 2D platformer microgame and do a 2D game. You could do the FPS microgame and do a FPS game. You could start from a empty 2D or 3D scene and just throw some stuff in there and mock it up. But I want you to kind of just decide how or you could, start from a 2D scene and do something entirely in UI. So start with something that you feel comfortable with and you think might be a relevant way of applying this. And then what we'll do is we'll go to the asset store and import the package, and we'll at least get like the first, an example of you setting it up, doing it yourself from scratch so that you feel comfortable doing it, and I can help you from here. But since we're at 6:25, we'll take a 5-minute break before starting up again. ask y'all to pick out something that would be a starting point for you to work on, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to help y'all to, so did you get a project set up with kind of the basic starting point? For example, like one of these, like the learning thing or the platformer micro game or.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What is the package called? I don't think I actually downloaded it.
Yeah, so what you can do is let's see. I'll help you out with that, and I will it's in this presentation, which I'll share later. But uh, I will post the link in our chat or in our Discord. So here it is. It's node-based dialogue system. If you want to look it up, but I'll make it easy on you. And in the Discord for the class today, I'm pasting the link. And so, of course, the first thing you want to do when you get to that link is before you make sure that you're logged in, because if you're not, then that'll be the first hiccup. And so once you're logged in with your Unity ID, then you can, add it to your assets and then click open in Unity and it'll open it in the package manager. I think it creates a folder called, let's see. So I'm gonna kind of follow along with you a little bit here. I saw that you're using the 2D example project. How about you? Which one did you pick? You picked that one too? Awesome. So yeah, once you actually have added it to your library, if you want to find it again, if you go to the pack, you don't have to. You can go to the Unity Asset Store, but you can also just look in Package Manager under My Assets. And so, for example, node-based dialogue system is there, and then I'll do the same. I'll download it, and then import it into the project. And then it's asking for some dependencies. Sure, whatever. Go ahead. Were you able to find it and import it as well, Danielle?
Yeah, I found it. It's just like you're always open here.
Ah, gotcha. Yeah, it can take a little bit of time to set up a new project and build all those things. So as I recall, I think it created a folder called like Dialog something, but we'll see in a second.
Are you different topics? Are you pitching for Creative Coast?
No, was that one of those things that Game Habitat is like you have an opportunity to win some money or something in the competition? Ah, that thing. Yeah, I actually looked into going, but that place is so far away.
Yeah.
I was like, I don't know that I can go all the way there. But no, I am involved with. Oh wow, holy
So
crap!
it's under plugins.
Dialog node-based system. Exactly, which of course, like you can drag that to wherever you need it if it helps you like find it. So since of course, before you get started in building anything, the smart thing to do is immediately to run the game and see like does it actually function? Because if it's broken from the start, you won't have any idea if you broke it or if it was already broken. So running the game and just being like, okay, I can move back and forth, I can jump, I can die. One thing I've realized is like, man, platform games are incredibly difficult for me using mouse and keyboard. I actually use this game as the basis for the game that I'm working on now. And once I got it set up with gamepad, it completely changed. And I actually had two of my friends try to play test for me, and they just kept dying everywhere. And they were they pretty much rage quit within the first. And I was like, oh, okay, gotcha. This has to be gamepad supported. But yeah, make sure that your game functions. And so then the next thing we can do, you can tell me, how do you want to set this up? Like, how do you want to trigger dialogue? It could be entering a trigger. It could be based on an event that occurs. It could be based on the player just pressing a button. However you like it.
Maybe. Yeah, keywords.
Oh, it's so hard. Coordinating. Oh, okay. If I do I press jump first and then forward, or do I press forward and then jump, and then do I need to let go forward before I press jump? And it also has terrible support for on being on a slope. Oh geez, like just don't even try to be on a slope and jump. Forget it. It's a remarkably bad example for an example project. So yeah, what are you thinking about in terms of triggering?
I was thinking maybe the slimes, they could say something.
Yeah, like you think when you approach the slime. All right. Well, we've got a slime waiting right here, and that's perfect. We kind of want to be close to the thing we're trying to set up, at least in the start, to make sure that it's easy to reproduce it. So the very first thing that we want to do is go into, so we, in assets, plugins, dialog node-based system, if you go in here and you go to the prefabs folder, you got the dialog prefab. And as I mentioned, that's the brains of this thing. And you don't need to change it. You just need to drag it into your scene here.
Where are you dragging?
From the project window, so in the project window here, if you go to Assets, Plugins, Dialog Node-Based System, and then Prefabs, and it's one of two prefabs in there. And then if you just drag that into the hierarchy, then you've got it here in your scene. And you won't see it. It actually has UI stuff in it. If you were to actually look in there, it's a UI canvas that has some hidden things that will show up when it gets triggered. But we don't have to think any more about it than that for now. But the thing that we do have to do, so we can take, what I recommend first is, since we've already kind of gone through and set up a graph and we know that kind of how that works, the first thing we want to do is we want to set up this trigger and just have it print a debug statement. So Johannes, do you have any idea what would be your first steps to setting up a trigger like that?
Well, I think this create a lighter trigger box state. Then I guess add
So yeah, you can, if you want it attached to the enemy, you can absolutely do that. One thing that you wouldn't do is to actually add, so you'll notice if you select the enemy, that he already has this capsule collider 2D, which is used for various things. And you can't put multiple colliders on the same game object. But what you can do is you can put one on a child of that. So for example, if I were to click on this enemy and say create empty, it creates a game object that's a child of that. And it's just an empty game object, but it's at the same location, which is going to work for our purposes. And so we can just name this trigger. And so now, and you can see, because if you have one of your transform tools like scale, rotate, move, you can see that that's the location of this game object. It's right on this guy. And so that's the better way of creating a trigger box that because a child of the parent game object is always going to move with, it's going to go everywhere that the parent goes. And so they're attached. And so okay, I'm not messing with anything on the enemy. All of its functionality should continue to work. What I'm doing is I'm attaching a child to it, and then I can add the component. And what we want is actually a box collider 2D. So there's two types of box colliders. One's used for 3D, one's used specifically for 2D. So if we add a box collider 2D, it's really easy to forget that this needs to be a trigger, because otherwise you're going to collide with it and you won't be able to enter it. So the first thing I would recommend is setting as trigger. But then the next thing you want to do is you're going to want to edit the collider. Because we're coming from the left-hand side, screen left. And so we might want this thing to be like a little to the side that you expect the player to come from. So something like that will let me get close enough. And the moment that the player's collider touches, this collider, is the point at which it's going to trigger the on trigger enter command. And so that's a good starting point. So I've got, let's see, if all of these stupid, let's see, make this guy go away. Where is the one that has, there we go. This guy here toggles the visibility of the gizmos in the scene and helps us. I think it's still going to go away when you select off of it, but once you select it back, if you select either the enemy or the trigger, you'll see the box. And that can be helpful just to know where it is. And a lot of times I'll also do this, shrink the 3D gizmos, because those 3D gizmos can be really big and kind of just make it hard to see things. So now we have this trigger. Now, one of the things I mentioned to you was that they actually give you the Dialog starter script in the Dialog node-based system package, and that's a good starting point. So if I do, let's see, I think it's probably in demo scripts, test Dialog starter. That's it. So that might be a nice starting point for us. Let's go ahead and like double click test Dialog starter to open it up. And just take, we can kind of see what's in it over there in the inspector, but let's take a better look at it here in Visual Studio. So this is the minimum we need to have in order to start. But, we would have to rename this script. It's like, well, maybe what we'll do instead is we'll create our own script and copy the contents of this. That also makes it so that if we ever screw something up and need to refer to this as an example, that we can do so. So now you're going to want to create a new script. And so you can either do that, in this same folder, or, we have in assets, the way this thing is already set up, it has a scripts folder. And so I'm going to recommend that you just put a new script in there. So what you do is you go to your scripts folder in the root, and then you right click, we could put it into one of these folders, but I think it's okay to just have it in the root of scripts. And then right click and click create mono behavior script. And when you create it, if you don't touch anything, you'll be able to immediately name it. And that's a good idea, because for scripts, the name of the file has to be exactly the name of the class that's inside the script. So if I go ahead and name this like, trigger dialog, and hit enter. And then for some reason it flips over to Visual Studio, but that's not what we want. What we want, it's going to take a second to compile the script, and then we'll double click on it to open it in Visual Studio. And it'll start out just a bare bones empty script. But what we'll do is we'll use a trick in Visual Studio so we can see side by side the script that we're working on and that example test dialog script. And that'll make it easy for us to copy things over and kind of compare them. Since what we're doing, so you have it attached to your, so we have our enemy's trigger and we put that on there. Is that right? Yeah. All right. And so then what we do is in our script, we don't need this stuff for now. And instead we're going to call on trigger enter 2D. So is that what you have, on trigger enter 2D?
No, I just copied the stuff.
Well, that's all right. I mean, because we're going to want to do that eventually. So, Daniela, for your benefit as well, we have these two scripts. This is the example script that came with the dialog system. This is the script that we're making now. If I click on this and drag it, I can break it off. And if I do this, I can see these two side by side. And so it can be really useful for copying things from here to here. But what I'm going to do before I bring this stuff over is I've got on trigger enter 2D. I'm going to say debug.log test trigger, and then close it with a semicolon. And so what I expect is, eventually I might want to check and make sure it's actually the player. For example, if you're shooting projectiles, that's a good way to unintentionally trigger something. But so now if I go back to Unity, So now it should be the case. So I'll pull my console over here so I can see it while I'm playing. Give myself a little bit more space. So now the expectation is if I walk into that trigger, did it immediately fire? Let's see. It immediately fired because I'm not testing for the player, and it's overlapping with with the enemy itself. And so I could do one of two things. I could either move it out so that it's not touching, or better yet, instead, what I can do is in the script, I can say if collision dot game object dot what's it? Is it tag equal, or is it tag? Or it's compare tag. And then player. And so then, let's see. So what I've got, now I'm making sure that, all right, first I check. So what happens is when on trigger enter automatically gets called when something enters that trigger. And what it does is it says, okay, what entered my trigger was something that has a collider 2D, and here it is as the variable collision. And so I can use that. I can say, okay, the thing that collided with the trigger, on its game object, see if it has the tag player. Now this of course will only work if our player actually has the tag player, which is a very common thing to do, so it already does. And so if that is correct, then print this debug log. I make sure that I've saved it, and I switch back over. And then when I run it, one, I shouldn't start off the game seeing it triggered. Good. And now when I approach my friend, test trigger, that's what I expect. So my trigger works. And so now I can say, okay, well now I know that a trigger will fire off code that I put inside that. So what I want to do now is I can remove that test, and now I'm going to put a bracket here so I can put stuff inside this bracket. But before I do that, I know that the stuff that I need is the stuff that's over here. And so what I'm going to need to do is I'm going to need to first have access to these two serialized things, this dialog behavior in the node graph. But you can see immediately, like, oh, it doesn't like that. And the reason why, it'll actually kind of tell you if you mouse over, it says, all right, essentially like, I'm supposed to be able to find this thing and you haven't shown me how to do that. And if I click on this, it'll even tell me the solution here, which like when you're missing a using reference, so you're trying to refer to something that you don't have the library to do so, like TextMesh Pro, or in this case, this Cherry Dev thing. If I had looked up here, I would have seen already, like I need to do this using, and that gives me access to everything that's in this package, so to speak, this library. So all of these things are special. They don't come with Unity, dialog behavior and dialog node graph. They're actually part of that package that we downloaded.
And you can tell because they're green, or does it not?
No, green means it's like a proper noun, like a thing. So, for example, I can have a, let's see, like a private text, or no, text alignment. A better example would be private game object. So you see how game object's green? That just means like that's a proper noun, that's a thing. Like Unity note, like components are proper names, like box collider, game object, rigid body, things like that. So basically, in order to fix this, like I could have either have done this first, knowing I was going to need it, or, so you see now that I have the correct library, it says, okay, these things are in that library. That's why I'm using that thing. So now I've solved that problem, and I can get access to those things. And then the other things that I want is like, okay, I don't have a start here, so I can copy this entire start function, and I can put it here and paste it. And so and that refers to these things here, and this is another thing that's like, oh, it's because this is this function, and I haven't yet copied that over. That's why this is complaining. So you might want to just be like, okay, like I'm going to copy over, make sure I've copied over everything and see if the errors go away. So once I put this here, debug external, that's what that was. So now what I've got the basics. And if we remember, so what I need to do is I need to call start dialog. Let's see. So that prepares it by loading it into the dialog graph. But I think that if I call start dialog, is that actually, let's see. No, actually it was start dialog. Oh, it's actually this thing that, so instead of running this thing, instead of doing this in start, so what this does is it links these two things together and then it starts the dialogue, but it does that immediately when the game starts because it's here. But what we want is we want that to happen not when the game starts, we want that to happen when it's triggered. So if we move it from there to there, that's essentially what we want. So when it starts, it connects these things together and connects it to this. And then when I enter the trigger, it's going to call start dialog and provide it the graph that we create. So now the script is set up, but we don't have we haven't yet created the dialog graph. So for example, if I look here in the script that we created, it is expecting two things. It's expecting the dialog behavior and the dialog graph. The dialog behavior is that prefab that we put in here, this thing. So I can go ahead and drag that over here. But the dialog graph is the thing that we created ourselves. It's the scriptable object that we created. And so we might want to just put that in the root of dialog node-based system. You might remember the way we did that was to do create scriptable objects, nodes, node graph. And so now we're going to say like blob speaks. And of course it's empty right now. But we can take that dialog graph editor docket, and before we forget, we can say, okay, let's go ahead and get this thing set up before we start putting it together. Let's go ahead and finish this setup by taking that graph and putting it here. And then we'll save our scene. So now, actually, not new scene, save scene. So now, technically, the setup should be ready, but until we've actually created at least one node, like we won't actually know if it's working or not. So let's go ahead and go to the graph editor, create a sentence node, and say, all right, it's blob that's speaking, and then it says blobby blob. And that should be enough. So essentially, and we know, okay, in that blob speaks dialog, there's a sentence node now, the one that we just created. So let's see if this works. So let's see. We got a null ref in get toolbar. Oh, that's weird. It seems to be some kind of dialog graph editor thing. Although here's a trick. if it goes away when you hit clear, it's probably not fatal if you're still moving. And so sometimes those things happen and it's really just like shut down Unity, open it back up, it goes away. Like, we're just going to pretend that didn't happen. But let's see if it broke anything. Oh, so, well, what happened was we did get our blobby blob thing to trigger. So it technically worked, but it also made Unity realize, hey, you're trying to use TextMesh Pro and you haven't imported it yet. There are some parts of the UI that come with Dialog. For some reason, this Dialog prefab that they include has some stuff that uses the old text system for UI and some that uses the new TextMesh Pro. So all we need to do is just import TextMesh Pro. TextMesh Pro is much better to work with in the long run. I don't know why Unity, I guess just, Unity hasn't ripped out the old system for legacy purposes, but so, and there we go. So now if I try to run it again, chances are the text will look a little better. But you might remember that, oh, I know what that is actually. You see, blobby blob. All right. So our custom dialogue worked. But you might have remembered at the start of the class, I said, hey, let's use this Unity project I've already set up, and I brought in the thing because it has some things that are broken, and I fixed them. And one of the things that is broken is that, for example, if I'm looking at my graph, there's icons that are supposed to be here that aren't, and it's because the developer used some of the built-in Unity icons that have now been removed in Unity 6, one in particular. And so that's this thing is actually saying, like, I'm looking for an icon in the Unity library that isn't used anymore. And so that was one of and it's non-fatal. It just means you're not going to see a nice, like, yellow circle coming out of this thing. And you can fix it, and you can actually do it by telling it to use a different default Unity button, or you can just ignore it. But like I said, it's non-fatal. And then, like I said, one of the other things that it's doing that is less than awesome, let's see. It's like, okay, if I exit that trigger and re-enter it, it goes again. All right. So now, if I want to actually see what this UI is, if I go to my scene view and scroll way back, and I mean way back, so now you see, okay, like this dialog prefab, now you can, these were disabled, these panels, but now they're showing because I've triggered them. So there's a canvas, a UI canvas, like you would put a HUD in or anything else that you're drawing to the screen. And then inside of it, you have this sentence panel, which is more or less empty. I guess it's got a image in the background. And you got the character's name text. You got the dialogue text. We're not using an image currently, but if we were, it would go here. But you can see that, like, okay, this text is TextMesh Pro text, but there's some other text that's being used in here that's like the legacy text. I think it's actually this answer panel thing. Let's see.
Change where the character shows up. This is only visible when.
That's a great question. Because what you can do, so you see if I go back to my scene, and let's close down some of this so we've got a little bit more space. So yes, this is a prefab. And so if we're going to mess around with it, it's kind of better to use this arrow to go into the prefab. And so now any changes that we make will affect the prefab, and so they'll always be there. Whereas if we were to make changes back here, unless we applied the overrides, then they would only be specific to this instance, and it wouldn't fix the problems that are in the original. So what I do is I go in here, and I know that, okay, this is currently hidden, but all I have to do to show it is to click this. This is what's the equivalent of set active true in script. And it's a very common thing to hide and show UI by taking the game object, usually a panel, and doing set active false or set active true. And so, for example, if I wanted to take this picture, we saw with the example with the skeleton in Blackbeard that the text actually runs underneath that picture, which means we could either move the picture out of the way, or if we didn't want to, we could take that dialogue text and we could shrink this so that it only goes to this point and then it starts word wrapping. So now, like for example, if I did this, and if I said, for example, what if I made this text like red and like stupid big? Let's see if that actually saves. What I have? Oh, I forgot to turn it back. This happens all the time. You forget to turn it back off, and then it's appearing, in the game, and you're like, wait a minute. It'd almost be nice if there was like an easier way to do that. So now if I walk into this trigger, and also, of course, like if there was a lot more text, it wouldn't go all the way over to here. It would word wrap around there. So you can change the placement, the layout in the UI, you can change the background, you can change where the image appears, move those things around in the prefab, and then, it'll respect that. And so you might want things to appear differently. Like for example, instead of having this appear as like what we're getting right now is kind of like the classic like old school Final Fantasy RPG kind of text, right? But if instead you wanted the text to be like literally over the character's head, if I were to say like, all right, let's go to that enemy. I'm going to focus on him so he gets up close to him. Yes, precisely. So now, instead of making this, instead of having this dialogue canvas be something that is in screen space, I can put it in world space. And then I'm going to do what I just told you not to do, which is make a bunch of changes without going into prefab mode. But what I can do with this canvas is I can shrink it, and I can put it over here. And I can shrink it even more. Let's see. Yeah, it's because of, when you're switching for world space, for some reason they always anchor it to 0, which means it always gets in the way of like your level design. You kind of, have to ignore it or turn it off or whatever. But when you switch it, when it's in screen space, it draws on the screen no matter where you are in the world. But when you're in world space, it's attached to a specific location in the scene. And so what I can do is I can continue kind of shrinking the entire canvas down, and I can put it over my friend here. And so I think that actually that should be enough for me to actually see the dialogue. Of course, you would want to change the way it looks, but now you see it actually is almost speech bubble-ish. So if you want to create something that's like a speech bubble that is anchored to an actual like person, then you would use a canvas that's world space. By default, you're drawing in screen space overlay, which is good for a heads-up display or anything that you want to fill the entire screen. So those are the main differences between those two approaches. Mm-hmm.
And if you wanted it to follow, if it's a character that
Mm-hmm.
because now we're setting all the dialogue to appear above this dude.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
So if instead, so here's a guy who's moving, and what I could do is I could say, all right, he's this guy. I'm going to actually have, yes, I'm going to put, I think that I could make the whole thing a child. So let's see if that actually works. So now if I run over to him, oh, that's right. Oh, there it is. It's because when I was over here, I was in the trigger. So you would want the trigger to go with it, but like yeah. Oh, I bopped him, and so he's dead, and so the trigger's not there anymore. But yeah, for example, if I said like let's just turn this thing on all the time instead of having it turned on by the trigger, And so now if I go over to him, like I can ignore this entirely. And there he is. Ah, he got me. But you see, because he's a child of this moving object, it's going to move with him, and the world space canvas will act like any other game object. I mean, everything in Unity is a game object. That's kind of like the basis for it. So basically, for I'm going to stop calling it homework because I think that's part of the disincentive of doing it. I think I'm going to start calling it your challenge. So the challenge between now and next class is to integrate Dialog into something that you are working on, whether it's just dabbling or something that you are making. And if you feel like Dialog is something that you really want to get into, and you've already seen the limitations of using the node-based dialog system we've been using, I definitely encourage you to try Arcweave instead, because it has a lot of support in terms of like tutorials and such like that, and it's not difficult. As I mentioned here, let's see, that there is, you can, I will put this where you can get to it, but you've got the instructions for quick start, and you've got the instructions for the Unity import. So you can follow the quick start guide to learn how to set things up if you've forgotten anything. But then in terms of actually getting it set up in Unity, as I mentioned, there's a Unity package that gives you that support for Arcweave. And then when you export the Arcweave project and just drop it in there and connect a couple of things up following these instructions, it's actually not any harder and a lot more stable. The limitation with Arcweave comes from the number of, like, so you can see here that, for in the free plan, I've placed 20 nodes and I can have a total of 200. And I can only have a total of 3 projects. But to learn and to decide, how useful this is to you, that's enough to do quite a lot, I think. All right. Awesome. Well, thank y'all for being here. And I've sent myself a reminder to let you know the schedule for the rest of the intro classes. So if you want to come to the programming class or the animation class, the next class next week is the 2D art in Krita class.
I missed that one.
Yeah, you're welcome to come and join that one as well. We'll have a guest speaker who is Mikhail Gruley from, he's the art director from Avatar Frontiers of Pandora. So he will be coming to share some of his stuff. He always has cool visuals.